Good morning, everyone. I'm Joanna Quilty, CEO of the New South Wales Council of Social Service, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to the annual NCOSS post-budget event. It's our opportunity to engage with our political leaders to dissect the budget and to understand what it means for our sector and for the people that we support. This year's event is particularly important given the extraordinary and uncertain times that we're facing, which we know are hitting vulnerable people hardest and pushing others into disadvantage for the first time. It's also an historic event because it's the first time that we've held it online. And while it's disappointing not to have you here with us in the room, it's great that over 300 of you have been able to join from locations across New South Wales. But I should explain to you where I am in case you're worried that we've overdosed on season 4 of The Crown and redecorated the NCOSS offices to emulate the Windsor Castle. That's not the case. I'm actually at the Giant Dwarf Theatre in Cleveland Street, Surrey Hills, where their technical wizardry far surpasses what we can do at NCOSS and where they're going to help ensure that this event runs smoothly, touch wood. This is also where we're holding our AGM tomorrow, and being a small, underfunded but highly resourceful NGO, we of course managed to negotiate a 2-for-1 deal. But before I go any further, I would like to invite the CEO of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Lands Council, Nathan Moran, to perform Welcome to Country. Nathan's organisation represents Aboriginal people across a vast area of Sydney, stretching from La Perouse and Rockdale in the south up to Yango National Park northwest of Sydney. But his offices are in Redfern, so thankfully he's able to join us here in person, which is wonderful.
Thank you, Joe. Bajuri Gamarua, Dian Babana Gamarada Gadigal Nagara. In the local Gadigal language, these words translate to G'day, women, men, friends, comrades. We're on Gadigal country. Standing here today to be part of the NCOSS post-budget virtual reality event. On behalf of Metro Local Aboriginal Land Council, the representative body of all Aboriginal people of the area we gather, being Gadigal country today, I'd like to acknowledge all of the respective First Nations from where all of you fellas gather us today on this virtual event as well. Yes, we're the rep body that stretches from colloquially Cessnock to Bankstown, or as we say, from Wanneroo country down to Bidjigal country. We extend out to Wiradjuri country, and we acknowledge all the various First Nations whose lands we take care of today. But from Gadigal Nagara country today, I'm pleased as the CEO of Metro Land Council to open up the NCOSS budget discussions and the virtual reality event for the 2021 budget. For Metro Land Council, our members are a reflection of the great state of New South Wales. We have Kooris, Gurris and Murris that come from all parts of this great state we call New South Wales. And indeed, we have many from outside of those lines, so acknowledge all First Nations around the country in accordance with our membership. For we are the first Land Council of Australia, founded in 1972, calling out for national land rights. We're the body that's continued the 1938 Day of Mourning that took place just a stone's throw from where I'm gathering today. So we inherit all of the legacies of our leaders of the past to represent all Aboriginal people, to protect and preserve the culture and heritage within our domains. We're also part of the yarn and discussions that we hope one day will get back to achieving national land rights that unfortunately we have not done, and acknowledging the thanks to the State Government of New South Wales, both Liberal, Labor and indeed all parties who passed in 1983 the Aboriginal Land Rights Act of New South Wales, which thus creates what I am today, Metro Local Aboriginal Land Council. On behalf of our members, I welcome you all to today's event. I'd also like to acknowledge on behalf of all us Kooris, Gurris and Murris, in terms of the budget, we note that it didn't contain any new rent payments. And I don't say that jokingly, because we acknowledge as the First Nations of this country that we believe there should be a greater investment in our communities and our culture, and in fact, hopefully a settling of an old arrangement about the dispossession of our entire state, including all of its minerals and its waters, and receiving only $500 million in a lump sum payment known as the Aboriginal Land Council's Investment Fund is not adequate. But we hope into the future value will be placed upon us and we can be part of the budget into the future. But I acknowledge the real reality of the need to digest, break down the budget, hopefully promote and discuss other matters that have been overlooked, but more importantly make as most of what we can as efficiently and effectively as we can the 2021 budget. I'd leave it to anyone who wants our mob's perspective to look at the State Land Council's website where there's a beautiful press release, but I really look forward to today's discussions and the many yarns that'll take place. I'd like to acknowledge the Treasurer who's part of today and also the Shadow Minister for Treasury who'll be joining us. So thank you indeed. Bajuri Gamarua, may you all have not just a good day, make it a deadly one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for that really warm welcome and that important reminder that we've still got a lot to learn from the rich culture and heritage of our First Nations people. And I think also the importance of working together in our advocacy efforts. So thank you very much for joining us. Before we get underway, let's deal with the housekeeping. There isn't any. You should all know where your nearest toilets and emergency exits are, and if you don't, I can't help you. But importantly, I can tell you we have Auslan interpreters online for this event. They will appear at the top of your screen, and there are instructions in the chat room should you wish to spotlight them and have a full screen view. Some details about how today's proceedings will run. Our speakers will be joining us online. We will first hear from the New South Wales Treasurer Dominic Perrottet, following which there will be a short Q&A with the Treasurer. We'll then hear from Shadow Treasurer Walter Secord and have the opportunity to put questions to him before Angela Jackson from Equity Economics joins us for a similar process. And we'll then have a panel discussion with Minister Gareth Ward kindly subbing in for the Treasurer, who has to leave us for another commitment. Because it's a virtual event and we have so many participating, we've reached out to our fellow peak bodies to help us prepare questions in advance, which will be asked by nominated people. We've also got some pre-prepared topics that I will explore with the panel in the discussion that follows. There will be opportunity for you to put forward your views and questions via the chat room. Our NCOSS staff will be looking at those and curating them, feeding them through to me to relay to the panel as appropriate. I know it's not as interactive an event as we've had previously, but please be assured, even if your question doesn't get asked, it's still really important data for us, and we will certainly be using it to inform our ongoing advocacy efforts. A final reminder. Our speakers have been asked to keep their responses to questions really on point and to a couple of minutes to ensure that we're able to get through everything we wish to cover in the time available. Not that I'm suggesting that our political leaders would in any way ramble, obfuscate or try and avoid an answer. And I would certainly never suggest that of our first guest. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce the New South Wales Treasurer and Member for Epping, Dominic Perrottet, who joins us today to provide an overview of the historic budget that he delivered last week, what it intends to achieve, the fiscal outlook for New South Wales and some of the challenges that we face. Thank you, Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Joanna, and thanks to everybody for joining online. Hopefully, in next year's budget, we can do this in person rather than through this new world we live in online. But look, I thought I'd just give a bit of an overview of the budget and obviously try and focus towards the end on particularly the social services sector and where those investments have been in this year's budget. But it's obviously been a very difficult time for our people and for our state over the last 12 months, and Todd handing down a budget in November, but had to do that in light of the pandemic. But this budget and this year comes off the back of a pretty difficult year last year where 99% of the state was in drought. We made significant investments in regional New South Wales to help those communities get through a very difficult time. $4.5 billion investment in drought support alone. It's really positive to now see regional New South Wales getting back on its feet after what's been a very difficult couple of years. And then obviously the summer bushfires were a very, very difficult time. Many homes destroyed, infrastructure damaged, and most importantly, many lives were lost. So So we've invested significantly as well off the back of that terrible summer, around $4.4 billion in investment in bushfires. And if that wasn't enough, then we came to the pandemic. So it's been a very difficult time. And early on, when the pandemic hit, I said to the Health Minister that there was not a dollar limit on whatever he needed, he would get to provide support to make sure our people were safe. And he clearly took up on that offer, because $3 billion later, we made a significant investment in our health system. We put our ICU capacity very early on. We invested a significant amount in our tracking and tracing teams at the outset of the pandemic. And I think they've proven to be not just national leaders, but world leaders in making sure we kept the virus under control, kept people safe, and allowed us to open up as much of the economy as possible. So if you go through the stimulus support we provided in the course of the pandemic, $16 billion at the start. We've updated that in this year's budget to $29 billion. And I saw firsthand very early on, one of our first areas we were looking at where should we be investing in stimulus, and we were speaking to a lot of businesses who provided payroll tax waivers, deferrals to. We spoke to a whole range of sectors, and we put a significant investment early on in maintenance and of social housing. And I went to Arncliffe with the minister, and we met many young men and women who were working on those sites who told us that other than the financial support that we provided, they would not have a job. It wasn't long later, I came back with the minister within 6 months and saw that those homes had been refurbished, and now people had been able to get into those homes. And that, to me, was a very striking example leading into the budget around the effectiveness of the stimulus in not just creating jobs and economic opportunities during construction, but importantly the great social benefit that can be quickly turned around off the back of it. And that was an incredibly pleasing thing for me to see, and also I think it will end up being one of the silver linings in the pandemic. And some of the programs, the wraparound service programs, early on, many people we were able to do it who were sleeping rough, we were able to get access to hotel accommodation. That was really positive. And the minister spoke to me at length around that time about how could we transition this, and by investing in further social and affordable housing and being able to put those wraparound programs in place. It was great to have that with Minister Ward in Fairfield in the lead up to the budget period, and met a young man who who had been sleeping rough, was now in accommodation and is now applying for his first job in many years. So I think this could be a significant focus and for the government going forward. And as I said, one of the silver linings of what the pandemic will provide. So then going forward, obviously we've made a significant investment in stimulus support during this period of time. Our revenues have been hit pretty hard, $25 billion reduction over a 5-year period, and that's led into a deficit of $16 billion for the current financial year. But we see that getting back to surplus in 24-25, and maintain that fiscal discipline, I think will be very important. But there's a lot of numbers there, but ultimately the budget is about people and what we can do to provide as much assistance as possible. We maintained our infrastructure investment. In fact, we increased it to $107 billion. That's supporting around 150,000 jobs every year. We continue to provide extra support for all of our areas of government, particularly in the health space, mental health particularly, because I think we can look at the health numbers that we see every day in terms of COVID-19. What we don't see is the hidden mental health costs that I think will only grow over time as a result of some of the challenges that we've been dealt with, not just during the pandemic, but over the last couple of years. And one of the announcements I made just on the Sunday before the budget was a significant investment in mental health nurses in our schools to make sure that our kids get the assistance and help they need. And there'll be 100 of those nurses, and we expanded that program. We'll continue to look for opportunities to improve it over time, and that come through that. And that's important when you're spending at the rate that we are at the moment, that we continue to evaluate and look at better ways of doing things. Provided extra support for high premises for women who struggle during pregnancy, and extra support for palliative care as well as our population ages. So there's significant support there in the service space. Our $812 million investment in social and affordable housing, I see this as crucial going forward, because if I look at those areas in the economy that in the short term had the most significant hit, it's hospitality, tourism, arts and recreation. But construction is down around 9%. But I'm really worried about the tail of that over the next couple of years, and that's where I think social and affordable housing will play a very crucial role, in that it's the very transferable skill set. So as private construction is struggling in the private housing market, the state can come in, fill that void, significant investment in that sector, and then once the economy is picked up, we could achieve many great things. So I think it's going to be a very important time there going forward. We made significant investments in the social sector transformation fund, about $50 million to help the social service sector adapt to the changing environment. I think that's going to be very important. We're moving to change as a government. I don't want us to just be followers, I want us to be world leaders, and I think that's important. We provide support for those other areas as well. We put $1.4 billion into support for out-of-home care, which Minister Ward's very close to, and further support for domestic violence funding as well. So I think right across the board there's been record investments, and there has to be, because I am concerned with the difficult time that our state will be going through. We can look at the economic numbers. We've had negative growth for the last financial year. This financial year, I expect that to return to growth next year. Our unemployment rate, at the start of the year, was 4.5%. That was the lowest in the country, and it had been at or below the national average for 6 consecutive years. We've seen that now spike to 7.2% this year's budget. Now, we had some good news last week. That's gone down to 6.5%, but we expect it to peak around 7.5% in December. And behind those numbers are people who will struggle to get into work, and we do everything we can to, as I've said from the outset, put the economy before the budget to help our people get through this very difficult time. So that's a significant focus for the government going forward. In terms of other areas, one of the key things I'm very much focused on is reform going forward, because it's not just about dealing with the here and now. We've got to make sure we set up our state for future success. We have a whole range of reforms in this budget around health and skills, tax reform, in the property market, to try and help people get into housing, at the same time drive economic growth going forward. Success for me will be getting that unemployment rate down to 5.25% by 23-24, returning growth over the next financial year, ensuring that we get our debt position we'll maintain it in a manageable state. And so far we've come into this budget and into this pandemic with strong foundations for which we can now invest and take advantage of record low interest rates. We're locking in 10-year bonds at around 1.1%. That's compared to about 6% 5-10 years ago. So there is a great opportunity here for us to make investments that will really help every one of the people across our state who needs that care and support to help us get through this pandemic. And the spending sometimes might not be perfect. I remember early in the pandemic speaking to a number of people, and the biggest focus was, look, you might not get everything right, but invest where you can, learn from those areas that you have that you may have had the same impact, and change those policies accordingly, and don't feel afraid to do that. So that's kind of the state of affairs here in New South Wales. It's going to be a difficult time for our state and our country, but I believe as a people we'll get through this stronger out the other side.
Thank you very much, Treasurer. And if I could start off the questions, are you able to tell us where exactly the New South Wales economy is at this point in time? Are we still in an immediate crisis response mode, or have we moved to the next phase? And how does the budget reflect that? Where are we going to be by May, and what will that budget look like?
So we had a negative economic growth last year, about -1%. This financial restrictions, I'm in there advocating for us to go further. But one of the challenges we have, particularly in Sydney, as our country's really truly only global city, we rely so much on tourism and on our educational exports for our economic growth, and we've been significantly hit by that. And we're continuing trying to work with the Commonwealth to bring international students in, because they're obviously key to our future growth. But we haven't been hit. I think we're also very blessed because we haven't been hit as hard as many countries around the world. And if I look back at the June quarter, we had our state final demand fall by 8%. In the UK, for that quarter, it was 20%. For New Zealand, it was 12%. And then you look at the health crisis overseas, it's been much worse than it is here. So yes, it's a challenging time, but I also think we can sit back and say, it's early days, but as a state and as a country, I think we're very lucky in terms of how we as a people have been able to deal with this crisis, manage the health response, and ultimately keep as many people in work and as many businesses going during what will be a very difficult time.
And so what do we think the May budget is going to look like?
It's going to be a difficult budget again. I mean, last year we had a $6 billion deficit where we're moving away from, I guess some of the surpluses that we've had in the past, but ultimately I don't want the budget to go in structural deficit, and that has downstream consequences. And what we want to make sure, whilst we'll be delivering another deficit in June next year, that we have a pathway back, because the decisions that we make today don't just impact the here and now, they also have a significant impact on generations to come. So it's very much a fine balance. But I believe in the June budget next year, we'll hopefully be seeing growth returning. We'll be seeing the budget slowly moving back into a balanced position, and continued record investments across the board to help people who need it. And as the pandemic goes on, we have to be agile and nimble and make sure that where gaps appear, we fill them. And we've been doing a lot of that work with the federal government. So where there have been areas that have been missing, we've tried to help fill that void.
So that leads us into a question that unfortunately I'm going to have to relay to you, because our technology has let us down and our participants aren't able to appear and ask the question. So this is actually one from Leo Patterson-Ross, who's the CEO of the Tenants Union of New South Wales. And he asks, do you accept that the modelling shows the economic benefits of state investment in social housing? And if so, what are the barriers to implementing a build in this area at scale? Or can we expect to actually see significant investment in the May budget?
I think you'll continue to see significant investment. We obviously made that $812 million investment in this year's budget. We've spent $6.6 billion over the 4-year period from 2014 to 28, or the 2014-15 budget to the 2018-19 budget. And for every $1 million that we invest in social housing, we create 5 new jobs and one apprentice should be supported. So I am very keen to continue to invest and look for opportunities to invest at scale, partner with the private sector about how we can invest as much as we can in construction during this period of time. As I said in my opening remarks, construction is probably the number one area going forward that is of concern to me. A 9% reduction in payrolls over the course of the pandemic. Now that's not as high as some of those other areas, but the trajectory will be a challenge for our state, and that's why I think the importance of getting people into work in that space are very, very shovel-ready projects that can drive economic growth in the short term, get people into work very, very quickly, but importantly have a great social outcome at the end of it. And with the wraparound services that Minister Ward is continuously advocating for, I think that can ensure that we get a great social outcome off the back.
Look, that's really positive to hear.
Will be key.
Yeah.
Will be key. I see it as a key aspect. It's central
That's excellent, because we know that it can be quick to market. We can be building that social housing right across the state in our regions, and that, as you say, it doesn't just create jobs in the construction industry, it also means that people are better able to look after themselves, look after their families and be productive members of their communities, which is what we're after. Can I ask, of the... Yes.
I saw that firsthand very quickly. To be in a position where I think it was in March when we announced our first stimulus package, to be back in 6 months, and when I was out there the first time in Arncliffe and saw homes that were worn out and not fit to live in, to then come back in a short period of time and see them all refurbished and people now who were previously sleeping rough in those homes was great to see. It's pretty rare in politics where you go from making an announcement at a press conference to seeing the benefit in a short period of time. That's a great aspect of what we can do in the social
Absolutely. And then those people are in a better position to get a job, and they're going to be less reliant on health and social service into the future. So yes, a good result all round, and we really look forward to further engagement around investment in social housing. I do have a question from James Christian, the CEO of the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, which is along the same theme. Many economists have continued to call for investment in social and affordable housing as a key economic stimulus measure. While some additional funding for Aboriginal housing has been earmarked, the New South Wales budget includes only 200 new Aboriginal homes. There are already significant shortfalls in housing supply for Aboriginal households of at least 11,000, which COVID-19 will exacerbate. So how does the New South Wales Government propose to meet Aboriginal housing supply demands, given that the recent budget allocated only a limited investment?
Well, the next 5 years, Joanna, will deliver around 3,000 new homes, and our private service partners, community housing providers, will deliver around 3,000 new social and affordable homes. Now, where we can do more, we will, and we want to make sure that no one's left behind, and there's significant support for those who are vulnerable in our community. There'll also, as I said, be lessons in terms of scaling up the construction, because we haven't invested this amount in the past. Yes, it's been strong investment. In terms of the scaling up here, it will be a significant task, and I want to ensure that, and this is, there's obviously a social benefit, but also the economic benefit as well, that they're built as quickly as possible. And we're very open to new ideas and new ways of thinking that we might have been closed to in the past, because government doesn't always have the answers here. But right across the state where there is a need for housing, we want to provide it. And I think what you'll see is a continued, whether it's in this budget, we've got a half-yearly review in February, and then the next budget in June. It's really 3 financial statements in 6 months. You'll see a ramping up and continued investment in housing. And but ultimately, we need to be learning from where is it working best, and then adopting that going forward. And if it's not working in certain areas, moving away from that. And so I'm going to be working very, very closely with the Housing Minister, Belinda Payne, and obviously Gareth, on what's the best way of making sure we can get this housing built as quickly as possible, and as many as possible in every area of the state that needs that support.
Because we do know that Aboriginal people are overrepresented in the homeless population, that our modelling tells us rising unemployment is going to significantly increase homelessness, and there will be a big increase for Aboriginal people within that. They're also very much at risk of overcrowding, so I think to make that a priority, and I know that James Christian from the Aboriginal Lands Council would really welcome the opportunity to be working in collaboration, and we'll have some great ideas about how to take that forward. My next...
One thing I've certainly learned through this period of time is being on the coalface and learning firsthand the experiences of people who are going through these challenges, the businesses who are trying to stay open. Understanding what they need has really been the impetus and vital direction of where our stimulus support has come. It hasn't come out of the bureaucracy. It's come from being on the ground, hearing what the needs are, and that's being able to direct our public policy position. I think yes, it's been a difficult year and it's moved very quickly, but there's a long journey to go, and the approach I think that you've taken over the last 6 to 9 months will need to continue over the coming couple of years.
Yeah, look, we've certainly seen an amazing level of collaboration between government and our sector to deliver results for vulnerable people, and we certainly agree it would be great to build on that and to continue that approach. My next question relates to the community sector in general. And it's from Nikki Sloan, who's the CEO of the Community Industry Network, which covers an area that includes bushfire-affected areas on the south coast. And she supports lots of small NGOs down there. And she says the community sector has very much been at the front line during the pandemic. We're very good at stretching our limited resources, but in this budget, DCJ-funded services received indexation of 1.4%, while our health NGOs received indexation of 1.75%, which really just seems unfair. So we're just wondering what the reason is for that.
Yeah, that was raised with me, and I'm looking at this. In fact, where it should be at, in my view, is from the wages position component. It should be at 1.75%. But in terms of the operating environment or component, I think that needs to change. And I received that feedback from you, and what I can commit to you today is for the operating component that's outside of the wages, that I'd peg that in a half-yearly review to Sydney CPI, which is around 1.1%. So I will work through that. I understand when I receive that feedback, it's something that I think we need to amend. And we have, as I said, the half-yearly review coming up in February, and I will work through this to increase that aspect of the funding. So it won't be a 1.75, it would be somewhere between 1.4 and 1.75, but I'm very happy to work with you to land that for the February statement.
And I think the issue of equity between the DCJ-funded NGOs and health NGOs is really important. Look, we are apparently running out of time. I did just want to say that our Wave of Disadvantage report, which I think that you've seen, it does highlight some really significant increases in disadvantage across key areas by June next year because of rising unemployment. Our services are already at capacity. The budget does maintain funding for some really important programs which we're pleased about, and that sector transformation fund that you mentioned is going to be incredibly helpful. But these measures won't necessarily address the tsunami of demand that's in front of us. So what else should we be doing to work with you and your department to ensure investment in the right places and that we have an inclusive and equitable recovery?
Well, Joanna, I would continue to do what you have been doing, and that is to work closely with the ministers, who I work very closely with as well. And during the budget process, I sit down with all of them, understand what their needs and concerns are. And obviously, it's always a difficult process that goes on where we work through, and obviously there are initiatives that we drive from Treasury, but to get an understanding of the needs and concerns. And I benefit a lot as Treasurer in getting out and about and seeing firsthand where the concerns are with the individual ministers. So my commitment to you and the sector today is we will continue to invest where it will have significant impact to improve people's lives. And I've actually learned a lot during this period of time, during the pandemic, by being on the ground, by working very closely with the ministers and working with organisations who you represent. And let's keep that going, because we all have one common goal here, and that is to help every single person right across our state get through not just this health crisis, but this economic challenge that we're going to be facing over the next few years. And you're right with that, homelessness, mental health. These are things that generally don't get headline figures in the budget. These are areas that don't make the front pages of the newspapers. These that ultimately
hopefully these are the people who are behind every one of our numbers in the budget and who we set out to support. So I want to make sure that every dollar that we spend, and that's my job as Treasurer, is making a real impact on the ground, and I'm very keen and willing to work with the sector over the next period of time to make sure that every single one of our budgets invests where it will make a difference to people's lives.
Well, thank you, Treasurer, for participating today in what I think has been a really productive discussion. As I said, we are so keen to continue to build on that collaborative, solution-focused approach, and we really want to work with you and your officials in the lead up to the May budget to ensure that there's a focus on measures that not only deliver jobs and stimulate the economy, but also strengthen the social safety net and ensure that we have a recovery that lifts everyone up. So this is the start of the conversation, and we know where you are, so we will look forward to being able to continue it. We thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Joanna.
See you. Okay, our next speaker is the Shadow Treasurer, Walter Secord, who will be presenting the opposition's perspective on the budget and the economy and what they would do if they were in charge. I should say that the Shadow Treasurer has had a lot of late nights this week. The Legislative Council has been sitting till very late and doing extraordinary hours, so we are very pleased that he's able to join us, and I'm sure we're going to see him on the screen very soon. And there you are. Hello. Thank you, Shadow Treasurer. Over to you.
Firstly, I acknowledge that we are an Aboriginal land, and because we're on different lands, I will pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I also wish to thank you, Joanna, and also acknowledge the Treasurer. So, the Treasurer and I are on very different sides of the political divide, but I am that he and the Premier have both focusing on COVID in New South Wales. And at the beginning of the pandemic, Labor gave a bipartisan commitment that we would work with the government when we could. Now, I have to acknowledge that while I am a partisan politician, I'm also a grandfather, and I have grandchildren in New South Wales. I'm a taxpayer, and I want to create a fair and just society. Now, yes, you're right, we finished 31 of debate, so I'm glad that I can be here. Now, for viewers, by now you would have noticed that I have an accent. I was born in Canada, and I migrated here 32 years ago. I tell you that because my background shapes what I'm looking for and what I'm committed to, and what I am committed to in public life. I believe that education and health are great levelers in an unfair society. I come from a very unusual background. My sister and I were the only two bicultural children at our rural school. We grew up on a First Nation reserve about 3 hours near Toronto. And my late father was a Mohawk Ojibwe First Nation, and my mother was the third European woman to marry into his tribe. So my father was illiterate, and he served time as a juvenile offender for car stealing, and my mother had me at the age of 15. I still remember telling one of my aunties that I was moving to Australia, and she asked me if I was coming home on the weekends. So education and health are why I'm standing over here. First member of my family to go to high school, postgraduate education, even flying an airplane. So enough about me. I just wanted to give you the content. So about the 10th Liberal National Party government budget, and everyone likes to say that this budget is about families, but in reality it's actually built on the backs of families, and I don't mean that willingly. Families are paying more tolls. Tolls are going up at 4% a year. There are massive fine collections in New South Wales, 651 million this year. Next year, 864 million, increasing up to $3 billion over the forward estimates. You know, to a tradie or a person living in Western Sydney, getting a fine can be the difference between making ends meet. Families are also losing schools. The government's selling off land, merging schools. Western Sydney is suffering from infrastructure neglect, whether it's clogged roads, lack of public transport in certain sections of Western Sydney, a government-obsessed and ideological obsession with privatisation. And at the last election, the Premier said that there'd be no more privatisations. And in this budget, 2 more privatisations. Another that concerns us is the 410,000 government workers, child protection case workers, nurses, cleaners, paramedics, who are being cut. So as for privatizations, we know that this is probably the lowest time to go to an international market for privatization. We have concerns about the WestConnect sale. Brett Holm of the Nurses and Midwives Association warned last week about the private provision of health, and we see that now. Last week, Northern Beach Hospital, the health scope, the people running the hospital want to reduce the conditions of nurses working at that hospital. So again, once something's privatized, you can't get it back, you lose a revenue stream. Now, I'll say a few things about the numbers that Treasurer Perrottet said. He said that we would return the surplus in 5 years. I actually believe that these are built on wildly optimistic premises. That we have global vaccine for COVID, which we hope, open international borders, all Australian territories are referred previous immigration levels. We have to remember, this is the first time since World War II there has been no migration to Australia. And our population, we expect that it would be 8.7 million by 2024. It's going to be 8.3 million. That will be an impact on the economy. Whether you have views on migration, and I have strong views, I support migration, that does affect the economy. And it's also built on the fact that we have no second or third waves. Now, those who criticize it, just remember, we are 2 to 3 days away from cluster. So again, and the final point is that the federal government and the state governments repairing relations, risks with China, and affecting trade. So again, I've got friends and families overseas, friends and family in Canada, Germany, Israel, and Israel has unemployment of 23%. So again, this is also about keeping a check on COVID. Also, the government has budget blowouts, $3.5 billion in budget blowouts. Just several days ago, $1.7 billion blowout on the light rail. Now again, that is money that can be poured into other sections of our society. New South Wales used to be the engine room of the Australian economy, and I believe that with a strong economy, we can provide services and support to those who need support. Now, in this budget, I think there's a real missed opportunity on social and affordable housing. In Victoria, the Anzac government several days ago, $5.3 billion invested, $5.3 billion invested in housing and affordable, social and affordable housing, 12,000 housing units. In New South Wales, 812 million, 1,200 units. Now, there's addressed 10-year waiting list for housing. In parts of the state, it's actually up to 1,000. 110,000 people are on the official housing waiting list. There's a two-pronged approach here. You could have alleviated the housing problem we have in New South Wales, but you could have also stimulated the economy with building housing, and you could also help tradies who repair and fix the housing. So a bit of a disappointment. My colleague Penny Sharp, the Shadow Minister for Community, Family and Community Services and Disability Inclusion, has already talked to me about the indexation, providing to the sector in New South Wales. She's raised that. As for our budget reply, we came up very strongly on a Made in New South Wales plan, creating jobs in New South Wales. We have the situation where ferries are being built in China and Indonesia, ferries that actually cannot get under bridges, ludicrous situations like that. So we also had concerns about the state government's response to unemployment. Now, unemployment currently sits at about 22 high, and in December, the government projects that to be an increase. In March, when JobKeeper comes to an end, that there'll be a real crash. Now, when we talk to EOs In the sector, we talk about food kitchens, international students. So again, there is, the government has no plan for the unemployment that comes in March. So we have a concern that we'd like to see the government still continue some form of action for job seekers. And also concern a lack of support for women and young people. I arrived in 1988, and I still remember the recession of 1991 and 92, where a whole generation of young people were starved by unemployment. So again, very, very little in this budget. Also, much talk about a deep recession. In parts of Western Sydney, Penrith, there have been spikes in unemployment amongst women. And that does not take into account women who have left the job force, who have simply done the mathematics where it's not worth. So again, a disproportionate effect on women and young people, disproportionate effect on international students, the tourism sector. We also find the arts and culture sector, hospitality sector. They were the first people to lose their jobs and the last people to come back on board. So again, that's our concern. Now, a number of other issues that were raised in the budget. Tax, land tax, and stamp duty. We've given our in-principle support to begin the debate on this area of reform, and we've set 3 tasks. That it must be jobs, it must get young people into homes or enable older people to downsize, or someone with a growing family to get into other housing, and it must be a fair tax system. So we've taken the bipartisan plan, and we're going to work with the government, but if we reach the conclusion that it's unfair, we will then make that known. I'll end up with a few other things just about individual healthcare in northwest of Sydney. People would have heard about doctors at Blacktown Hospital, doctors and nurses, one day strike because of maternity services. The best thing the government can do is to honor their commitment to a hospital at Rouse Hill. Also, deep concerns about the second stage of the Canada Rail. Again, overdevelopment, but a lack of services. People talk about clogged roads pre-COVID, but we have to provide public transport so that people can work to their home. 91 ghost schools are concerned about selling school land and merging schools, particularly on the north coast, and very little in the area of numeracy and literacy in this budget. Now, I worked for Bob Carr. I was Bob Carr's media director for 10 years. I still remember in the 1990s, the OECD, before the New South Wales, the ACT, and Finland were first in the world for literacy and numeracy. Now we are 20th in the world, and that is just, we're letting down a whole generation. And again, as I said earlier, education and health are great levelers in an unfair society. And I'm very disappointed that there's very little in the budget for that, particularly learning during COVID. I would have been able to educate me or support me. They would have just simply been unable to support me during that time. So I fear that certain parts of Sydney will be significantly disadvantaged because of the remote learning. So again, I'll leave it at that. For the next item, I would like to put some questions.
Thank you, Walt. We might cut straight to Kate Munro. I think you covered off on quite a few issues that we were going to ask in our questions, but Kate Munro, who is the CEO of Youth Action, did have a question concerning young people. Hello there, Kate. Fire away.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for giving us this opportunity, and thanks for taking the question, Treasurer. Look, you already talked about young people and the concern that you have, so I guess for us it's a concern as well that young people are being hit so hard by this recession, and particularly those who were already tackling disadvantage to begin with. And again, you mentioned the potential lifelong consequences, so that's a whole generation of young people. So my question is, look, young people consistently tell us that they want to be part of the discussions about what happens next. They're really interested in being involved in that. So my question is about, I guess I wanted to ask, what would you do to make young people a focus, and how are you looking at giving them input into the decisions as well as having a voice in this recovery process?
Okay, well, my colleague Penny Sharp, works works quite a bit in this area, involving dialogue, talking to young people, and that. We consider the conversation, and I'm one of the people that I feel that I try to be accessible, I try to be open. So open dialogue with young people, representative groups. But again, as you said, the whole generation started in the early 1990s. Unemployment. And also recognize that there was also a section of the community that did not necessarily want to go to university. And we, in the coming next election, before the next election, will be doing policies involving TAFE. The jobs and opportunities in parts of the community where the training has to match the needs of the area. Now you go down to southwest Sydney and western Sydney, unemployment rate is double what it is in other parts of Sydney. So indeed, it's about matching TAFE to the need and recognizing that not everyone wants to go to university, but also entering into new ideas and also expanding apprenticeships and making it actually worthwhile and looking at subsidies and supporting area. I'm not going to announce our election policies right now, but we are looking at I'm working with the HODGIG involving TAFE, so a number of things in that area, but also it's listening to the ideas. And government, let's come forward in the next 2 or 3 years with ideas that we support or we think that are worthwhile. We will throw our support behind them.
Thank you, Walt. That is fantastic to hear. We're going to leave you there just for the minute and return to you when we have our panel discussion. But we might now go to Angela Jackson from Equity Economics, because I think we're running a bit over time here. So Angela, if we can get you up, if you're able, oh, look at you, you look fabulous. If it's possible to get you to confine your opening remarks to a couple of minutes, and then we'll throw questions at you, and then we'll move into the panel discussion. But over to you.
Thank you. I will. Thank you, Joanna. I'd like to acknowledge you and Walt. It's lovely to see you again after a number of years. I'd like to acknowledge also the Wurundjeri people. I'm calling from Melbourne today, who are the traditional owners where I'm calling from, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Well, what a year. I think, as we come into Christmas, it's really a time of reflection, and also as we look at this budget, about where we've come, and we've faced the biggest economic shock, certainly in all of our lifetimes, and this health crisis has turned into a crisis for the community sector, for individual households, and now for our economy. The impacts have been huge. We have seen a huge drop in employment across the economy, and while there has been a recovery, it has been quite patchy. And some of the figures I was looking at last night in New South Wales are quite concerning. So while that recovery is underway, we see that most of it is in part-time employment, and so we're still seeing this huge drop in full-time employment. And in fact, full-time employment has only come back around 20,000 jobs since May. And so what we're really seeing is this sort of the response to the economy is not coming back anywhere near where it was in terms of people's overall workers' income, which means households are going to be under a lot of stress in the months and years ahead. We also see, as we look forward, those headwinds, which the Treasurer talked about, which are in his budget, which are going to slow down that economic recovery even more. The migration that clearly in Sydney and Melbourne has really fueled economic growth for the last 10 years is not going to be there. The international students are not going to be showing up. And of course, if you think internationally, and while Australia is great because we're COVID-free or almost COVID-free, if you take out South Australia, the rest of the world isn't in that position. So our exports are going to be quite weak. Now, what does that mean? And what does that mean for you and your services? Well, the report that we did really was trying to get to the fact that yes, jobs are important, yes, economic growth is important, but what actually matters about this is what the impact is on people. And we know that the relationship, and the reason we want a strong economy is because it helps our families, our communities, our individuals. And when the economy is not strong, life gets a lot harder for people. And the recession is a shock which can really increase disadvantage across Australia, but particularly, obviously, we look at New South Wales. And that disadvantage can become quite entrenched. And we know from previous recessions that it becomes quite place-based, and some areas can take 10, 15 years to ever really fully recover. So investing now in those supports and supporting people in terms of their mental health, in terms of their housing, in terms of domestic violence and student attainment is vitally important, because undoing the damage that this recession can do to people and to communities takes a hell of an effort going forward. So you're much better investing now. Now, I think what we can see across particularly our state budgets, and we've just had Victoria's this week in New South Wales, is a recognition of that. So I think credit where it is due, both state governments, our bigger state governments, have recognised the importance of investing in like social housing, in homelessness services. There is a difference in scale though. So I would say that certainly in Victoria, there has been, I'm not sure if they looked at the New South Wales budget and they just said we're going to double it or triple it. It's possible because a lot of the numbers are literally double, and one could be, maybe Dan Andrews was just like, whatever they do, I want to double it, I'm not sure. But scale is potentially a problem for New South Wales going forward. And it was, I think, heartening to hear the Treasurer today talk about that, yes, this is just the first step potentially in social housing, because that is clearly a key area where we know construction jobs are being hit hard, particularly in New South Wales. In fact, construction jobs are down further in New South Wales than they are in Victoria. And so just to sort of go to the scale of the problem in New South Wales. So certainly investing in social housing to support those jobs now. But it's also the foundation that we know to tackle disadvantage, and that affordable, secure housing for people and our communities can really, I guess mean that we have a long-term benefit from this crisis and this economic response. So look, I'll leave it there. I'll say that I think, the New South Wales budget overall, from an economist's point of view, was positive. I think it possibly hasn't gone far enough in terms of addressing the scale of the challenges. I think there's going to be a need to be more direct support for jobs in the next budget, so that unemployment rate can come down faster. But I think it's a good start, and at least the issues that need to be addressed are being addressed, and that's a really important factor. The other thing I would just add in there from the economist's point of view is around this issue of inflationary increases. I think it's really important we recognise that the cost of delivering services in a COVID-safe way is much higher. And so to just look at inflation, I think, is really missing a vital point. And we know that in health services, but across the board, the new way of doing business, we really have to grapple with this, is going to be a lot more expensive than it was previously. And even with the vaccine, there are going to be significant operational changes. And if we don't address that, then we're going to have real cost pressures going forward. And the sectors, the health sector and aged care and other care sectors, are simply not going to be able to deliver the same level of services as they did before. So that's just a little aside.
No, that is a really good point, and we will make sure we raise that with the Treasurer when we're talking indexation. We are going to go to Delia Donovan with a question. She's the CEO of DV New South Wales, but while we're getting her up on the screen, I will just ask you, the modelling underpinning the Wave of Disadvantage report looks at how unemployment by June 2021 will impact disadvantage, but modelling isn't an exact science, so just wondering how that is stacking up against what we're seeing now.
So it's certainly true. The employment outlook does look more positive than we had in our report, because figures have been updated from the Reserve Bank, and the economy is looking stronger than it was. But I will still say, look, the scale of the disadvantage is still there. So while it maybe not necessarily exactly what we had forecast, because forecasts do change, I think it's just important for government to keep in mind that this disadvantage will become very entrenched and very place-based. And have broader impacts to local communities, even that we, and a lot of what we did in our study is quite conservative as well. And so some of those impacts may well be greater anyway. And it's just important that you think forward rather than, us, as economists, we will love, to be honest with you, this year, because it's going to give us a hell of a lot to study in the years ahead. But let's use the evidence we have from previous recessions to really know where we need to invest to stop those really negative impacts going forward, because those negative impacts ultimately affect the economic productivity of the state. So, if people's mental health is poorer, if they're not their capacity to work is less, well then your economy cannot be as productive as it could be otherwise. So investing now will pay incredibly strong long-term dividends.
Absolutely. So that does bring us to Delia and a question about women and the impacts of the recession on them. Have we got Delia joining us?
Yes, so you, Angela. I think it's really interesting to hear about the comparisons with Victoria as well, and confronting for us all. So moving to my question, women have been the hardest hit by job losses in this recession. There have also been sharp rises in domestic violence. Increasing female employment and lessening the gender pay gap are linked to falling levels of domestic violence. Do you think the budget does enough to get women back into the workforce and to create well-paid, secure jobs for them? Thank you.
Well, again, I would say it certainly did more than the federal budget, which completely ignored this issue and was heavily criticised for that. So I think the New South Wales government clearly has recognised the gendered nature of this recession and of this downturn. Has it done enough? Look, I think that's it's a big question. I don't think it's an open question. Possibly not. And I think the same could be said for the Victorian government. It certainly has done more than has previously been done. There has at least been a focus on female jobs and employment. And in the New South Wales budget, there's a number of important initiatives outside, gendered, necessarily dressed up measures. For example, in education, school tutors will employ women, but supporting children helps female participation. The gender initiative is really important as well. Is it enough? Possibly not. That said, really what we needed to see was greater leadership, I think, at the federal level around childcare to get people back into work. And, it's difficult for the state governments to really have been left, to be fair, to deal with the gender nature of this and to also deal with direct job creation because the federal government just didn't really go into that space at all. So they have done more and they have recognised it. I think we still need to see more. Otherwise, we will see that increasing rate of domestic violence because the real risk coming out of this recession is that inequality is going to get worse, not better. And the reality in Australia, we need to close that gap. We have fallen behind the rest of the world in terms of female economic participation and performance. We need to be closing it, and what this recession is going to do is potentially widen it even further.
And now we have a question from Julie Hourigan-Roos, who's the CEO of FAMS, before we move into our panel discussion. Are we able to get Julie up? Here she is. Hello, Julie. Nice to see you.
You're on mute, Julie.
Yeah.
Sorry, thanks, Joanna, and hi, Angela. My question is around restaurant and entertainment vouchers and whether they are a good form of economic stimulus. Because I wonder if they're just not a short-term fix and what we really need is stimulus that's going to deliver jobs and benefits over the longer term.
So they are a short-term fix. They're definitely a consumption measure, but it's part of the suite you need in an economic response package. So I think often we want to go, you should do this and this. That there does need to be the two speeds, so the short-term support for those sectors, and they have had huge drops in employment, and so getting people back out spending is important. Whether it works, whether it's enough or it's right, targeted in the right way. I understand in New South Wales, you have to go on a Tuesday at 3, it's very particular about when you go. I think let's wait and see. I think it's possible that there's too many constraints around it, but I think getting people out spending again is important. But you also need to have that long term. So it's, if you think about the GFC response from the Rudd government, there was the sugar hit, but then there was the long-term construction, and it is that balance between the two that's needed. So it isn't high value, it isn't going to change the world, but it will get people back into work, and that is important, and it will get the economy moving again. So yes, it isn't the highest quality, and it's not something that I think, we'll look back on and go, oh, well, that was, but if it gets people back into work, then it's, a good thing.
And I think it'll be interesting to see if people actually use them. But that does bring us to our panel discussion, and we're now going to be joined by Gareth Ward, Minister for Families, Communities and Disability Services. So welcome to the Minister, who I'm hoping to see. Hello, lovely to have you here, Minister. And our other panellists, the Shadow Treasurer and Angela. My first question is not something that's usually seen as front and centre for our sector, which is the issue of land tax, and which was flagged in the budget as a much needed reform. So moving from that upfront stamp duty cost to actually an annual tax. There does seem to be wide support for it from quite diverse groups, but as with anything of this nature, the devil will be in the detail. Minister, if I could start with you, do you think it will make a difference for low-income households? Is it going to be good, bad, or in fact irrelevant for them?
Well, thanks, Joanna. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land for me to thank their custodianship country. Can I also just briefly acknowledge all of the sector for their tremendous work this year. It's been a really tough year, and I just want to thank everybody across the sector for their wonderful partnership and their hard work, and also all my shadow ministerial colleagues that worked really collaboratively with me this year. This has not been a year for politics, it's been a year for keeping people safe and particularly our vulnerable. So thank you to all. Look, in relation to the question, land tax has been a feature of our system for over 150 years. It came in 1865, and look, I think after that amount of time, it's worth taking a bit of a look at. But I think what we need to do is work through this consultation period. It is a proposal at this point. And what the proposal is in a nutshell is, do you want to pay stamp duty up front, or do you want to elect to pay an annual fee over time at a much lesser rate? Look, over the course of people's careers now, John, people will have 17 jobs, 15, 5 careers, they'll move multiple times compared to previous generations that might move very, very rarely. So getting into home ownership for workers, for young families or first home buyers, or even older people wanting to downsize, is often a barrier because of stamp duty. Some people have to work 2.5 years just to pay the stamp duty if they want to get into home ownership. So for me, I've already had some initial conversations with the Treasurer around safeguards to make sure that renters are not affected, to make sure that there is provisions for hardship, so there are supports in place. But I don't have a problem having a discussion around tax reform. In fact, I think after 150 years or more than 150 years, it's reasonable to ask that question. Now, the Treasurer has made clear this would be a revenue neutral policy. It would generate $11 billion worth of economic activity. We want to encourage people into home ownership. I don't think there's anything wrong with that goal. In fact, I think it's a very purposeful and meaningful goal. But we also need to make sure that those people that are not at that point, that are renters, also are supported. And I've certainly asked those questions. And look, I encourage people, come forward with your views. There's a reason why we've gone out with a discussion paper. We're not simply imposing this on the public. We've said it's a meaningful reform, a meaningful discussion, and I'm keen to hear from the social services sector on how they believe this could or couldn't work.
So I do want to turn to that question of hardship, and Shadow Treasurer, the opposition has offered its cautious support provided issues of hardship and equity are dealt with, and I'm interested, Shadow Treasurer, in what sort of concessions and exemptions you think will be necessary to make it fair.
Hello, Gareth. I will. So, home ownership. When I first arrived here in September 1980, home ownership was extraordinary, and in the 1950s, about 70% of people own their own homes, and now it's fallen down to about 64%. And Europe is absolutely right. 2.5 years. The current situation of owning stamp means that most young people who want to make the first home purchase, delay that by 2.5 years because of stamp duty. Now, I've actually looked closely at the package and we thought comprehensive briefing from stamp duty and very new next day. But I've actually done the maths. There are some aspects of this package that are attractive to older people who want to downsize, who want to leave the big home and go into a retirement village or a small community. So we'll favor them. And also, there's some concern that the first one will apply to farmers and farmland. So there are things, this is new territory, and they're going to happen sometimes because yesterday some accountants came to me and said that with the new program, Contagious Guarantee, that they believe that there could be a spike in the increase in housing in the lower end of the market. So again, the onus is on the government to actually come up with the safeguards, but we are going to point out to them our concern. And one of the very first concerns would be that there will be a bit of a sugar heat, not a sugar, a bit of a spike in prices at the lower end. So we don't want it to defeat the purpose.
So I think we're kind of losing you there a bit, Shadow Treasurer, but I might move to Angela and ask whether there's a risk associated with moving to this annual rate, which means it could be passed on as a rent increase, which will, you know, obviously have a big impost, particularly on low-income households. Is that a risk? And does, you know, removal of no grounds evictions need to be part of the package?
Well, I think there should be moved to that anyway, so that's just, I think security of tender for renters is really important. But I think, so from an economic theory perspective, no, it shouldn't necessarily lead to an increase in rents. And that's because the landlord has to pay this tax whether they have a renter or not. And so the incentive is still there for them to get a renter in. And so if they jack up their rents, they're less likely to get a renter in. They still have to pay the land tax, and, you know, they're in a bad position. So that's the economic theory. It's whether or not, from a pricing perspective, people view the land tax as something they need to recoup, so that they view it as an ongoing cost, and so they look to increase rents anyway. And if you've got a tight rental market, then that may well lead to rent inflation. So I think you need to have safeguards in place to ensure that doesn't occur. But from an economic perspective, you know, stamp duty is an incredibly inefficient tax. It's one of the big problems with our overall, you know, why housing is so expensive in this country and why we don't have that turnover of stock that we would have otherwise. I think the reform is a good one. It's a hard one. It's hard to explain. It's politically difficult, and that's obviously why there's this choice element in it, which I would say is not necessary from an economic perspective, but I understand politically it probably is. So look, I think overall it's the right approach. It's good economic reform, and it will make housing overall more affordable, especially if we can get that downsizing happening, because it's a huge problem where, you know, the old people, you know, not sorry, old people, that's what I've been from, but, you know, where retirees stay in these big family homes and they don't sell them. So the extent to which it encourages that and frees up that stock, you know, it will be a good thing.
Thank you. I want to move from that topic to something that is really front and centre for our sector, which is that issue of rising demand. Our modelling tells us that unemployment is going to lead to those dramatic increases in demand for specialist homeless services, domestic violence support, housing products like rent choice, information and referral, tenancy and legal advice, family support, youth services across the board. But the budget pretty much delivers business as usual. Sure, there were some increases in particular areas, but overall it was really about maintaining what's already there. So I guess my question is to our Minister. What advice would you give to services about managing rising demand in the face of no additional resources? And how do they balance that shift to crisis support and emergency relief when we know that the ongoing critical need is for early intervention and prevention services?
Well, Joe, this is my second budget as Law Minister, and I think I probably learned some lessons from the first budget to this one. But look, I look around the world and I see the extraordinary cuts that governments are making to all sorts of services, including social services. But I think in light of the economic challenges that we've had, the fact that we've been able to provide for record budgets in every area of the social service portfolio I have, is actually a good outcome, even though I can always appreciate that people always want more funding for the things that we know are working. I'd argue that if you look at other examples, there's actually been dramatic changes in budgets that have been incredibly hard for a lot of vulnerable communities. One of the focuses of this budget is funding and indeed continuation of funding for those targeted early intervention programs and services that we know work. And I think you all know me well. One, my door is always open to anybody. And secondly, if I think that there's a program that works or should be continued, I'll certainly bash the Treasurer's door down. It's a path I know well. And being at the fight that we've had on everything from ERO through to other supports and services and enhancing the investments we've seen in homelessness services during this critical time, we have been able to get some pretty significant wins that are not being enjoyed by sectors elsewhere. Now, always more to do. I'm always up for a fight, as you know, and I think there is a lot more to do, and I look forward to working with the Secretary in order to achieve that.
So I think Angela made a really good point before that the cost of service provision is going to increase beyond inflation because of needing to be COVID safe. Will you back us in on approaching the Treasurer on that issue to get the that level of indexation that we need?
Well, look, I've always been an advocate for making sure we get the right rate of indexation, as you know, Joanna. We've worked together on that, and we've been able to secure some great outcomes, particularly moving forward, to make sure that that indexation is a factor of contracts moving forward, so the sector is at a disadvantage. Because I know that when Federal Fair Work Commission make a decision that doesn't align with the agreements that have been made at the state level, that can leave services wanting. I don't want to do that at this time, and I'll continue to be an advocate alongside the sector for the right outcomes that make a real difference.
Fantastic. We'll be there with you. Sounds good. Okay, I have a question about the community sector again, recognising that it is a major employer in its own right and it does make a significant contribution to the New South Wales economy, directly through jobs but also indirectly through getting people back on their feet and less reliant on health and social services. And I think during the pandemic we've absolutely seen that it's proven itself as a provider of essential services. So how do we encourage better and more secure, better paid jobs in the sector for people leaving school or needing to retrain at a later point? And how do we ensure that government sees it as worthy of investment and development? And Minister, over to you.
Well, Joe, that's a really great question. And as you know, I know that NCOSS and you in particular have been an advocate for a sector transformation fund. Now, in the time I've got to know you, Joe, it's always best just to say yes. It's always best just to say yes. And of course, in the budget, a feature of funding for our sector has been a $50 million sector transformation fund. And as I've indicated to you, and I'll indicate publicly, I want to work very closely with NCOSS in developing how this money is spent. We've learned a lot throughout COVID. We've learned how to respond in a bit of an agile way. And I think some of the lessons that we've learned through this are very, very valuable for the workforce moving forward, but also how we can continue that journey together, that really important transformation to get services in a space where they can respond to challenges like this, as they have done so well, but to continue to meet the challenges moving forward. I'd also say that we've secured additional funding over and above that $50 million for the disability service sector, $17 million for employment initiatives and incentives to get more people into the disability services sector. And the NDIS has seen more than 50,000 people receiving supports for the first time because of that great bipartisan agreement struck and, of course, that ongoing partnership that exists. And there's great opportunities in the disability services sector. I want to see the First Minister for Disabilities to have the experience of disability, strong and vibrant disability.
Yeah, and certainly there are opportunities and there's lots of demand, but we also know that often those jobs are highly casualised.
One last thing I want to add is I think that one of the strongest things we also can do to provide surety in the sector is funding security. And a lot of the things that I've been able to achieve are locking in for longer periods, contract arrangements so there is security around jobs. There's a great example there with disability advocacy, which we announced. And of course, we're going through the recommissioning of specialist homelessness services at the moment.
So can I ask, do we now generally accept that competitive tendering for social services doesn't deliver the right result and causes expensive, unnecessary disruption, and that in fact working with proven, trusted providers while still ensuring obviously accountability, value for money and outcomes is the way to go?
Well, Joe, I've got to report on this, as you know. I mean, I received a Auditor General's report that said re-tendered a lot. And of course, what did I do with TEI? I didn't do that because I didn't believe that there was sufficient competition in the sector. I didn't believe the disruption was worth it. Thank God we made that decision because the TEI sector in particular has been a tremendous support to communities throughout COVID and bushfires in particular. But look, in relation to specialist homelessness services, obviously we provided that extra year of funding. We worked with the sector to say, here are the outcomes we want to achieve. Let's work together to try and get outcomes that are going to benefit the sector. You know, I think there are times where recommissioning is important and re-tendering is important. It just depends on the circumstances at the time. But I know that I've done my best to work through the issues with each of the peaks and each of the sectors to try and get the outcomes that matter most. I think simply saying no to re-tendering is not the right move, but in the same vein, I'm also not so puritanically ideological that I also don't think that simply re-tendering everything is the right way to go either.
Okay, I do want to touch on the issue of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people and the impacts of the pandemic on them. I might throw this question to our Shadow Treasurer, but certainly the modelling tells us that unemployment levels by June will lead to significant increases in the number of children and young people at risk of significant harm. We've already got Aboriginal children and young people overrepresented in our out-of-home care and our child protection systems, and they are going to those numbers are going to further increase as a result of rising unemployment. At the same time, the government has committed to reducing the number of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care by 45% by 2031. Doesn't this suggest that at the very least we need substantial investment in Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to deliver the ground-up solutions required to provide the right support in community, and that we've got to move away from approaches that undermine self-determination and that resonate with historical past practices and that haven't worked?
Absolutely, Joanna. My shadow ministerial colleague, Penny Sharp, and the Shadow Aboriginal Affairs, Mr. David Harris, have spoken at the Shadow Cabinet often about this matter. Now, I have a personal commitment to this welfare. Now, I know that you cannot compare First Nation situations in Canada to Australian First Nation situations, but the budget preparations for the next budget are beginning today. I think the government will have to reach the conclusion that programs, whether it's Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal programs, will have to continue longer. And if there's a slight recovery in employment, we cannot simply neglect the most valuable groups. That's serious. So, not the time to make cuts. I believe that Aboriginal organizations should be properly funded, and Aboriginal people should make decisions involving Aboriginal people. That often raises Aboriginal here, raises them in the Shadow Cabinet. Now, back to the question that was earlier about early interventions for the non-government sector. I actually believe that early interventions save the government money in the long term. As taxpayers, it saves us from the tackle problem early rather than later. Now, another matter that we put to Gareth, NCOSS take the same offers against us. The door is always open to come. I'm old enough, I'm ugly enough to take criticism and to be told I'm wrong. And I just think that the government may have to reach a conclusion that support may have to continue for longer, and in fact have to support the community sector a bit longer than it is.
So the Megan Davies Family is Culture report recommended setting up an independent Aboriginal Child Protection Commission if we're really serious about self-determination and Aboriginal governance and decision-making structures. Is that something that a Labor government would support?
Okay, I cannot make a commitment on that because that is pretty sharp and David Harris, but Penny has spoken at senior leadership levels in the Shadow Cabinet about this matter. That's their portfolios, but I would support Penny and David at their recommendation. But I can tell you, it's already something that's exercised decision-making in the Shadow. If we get closer to the election, we'll spell out our policies, but I can assure you that Penny has already raised this at the levels that are ministerial clients.
Okay, I do want to now just touch on mental health before we need to finish up here. The latest Productivity Commission report really spells out the significant issues that are wrong with the system. It basically says that it needs to be reoriented completely. Our Wave of Disadvantage report tells us that we are going to see significant increases in mental health issues, particularly for young people between the ages of 18 and 24. We're going to see, unfortunately, increases in suicide, and they're going to be happening at a much greater rate in some locations throughout New South Wales. So, look, the wellbeing nurses in schools are incredibly welcomed and will certainly make a difference for those students who can access them. But is that enough? Don't we need to be doing significantly more when we know that we are going to have, you know, some very, the mental health issues that we will be facing will be huge. And I might go to Angela first on that question, if I can.
Look, certainly, Joanna. I think, again, the state governments have clearly recognised the mental health impacts of COVID-19, but even before then, we were facing a real crisis in mental health support, I think, across Australia. And understanding the link between that and the economy is also really important. People who are suffering mental health or not being treated, getting support, less productive, less likely to participate in the labour market. So it has huge economic impacts as well to not address. And we clearly underinvest in Australia and probably around the world in this issue. So coming out of COVID, I think what we have seen is the importance of mental health. I think we've all suffered. I mean, I'm in Victoria here, so I'm talking about someone who's endured a much longer lockdown, but certainly it's something we're talking about a lot more in terms of the mental health and the mental load of this. For our kids, it's vitally important, but it's important across the board. People can't work as well. People can't engage in the workplace as well if they're not supported in their mental health. So investing in these services, it seems like a cost, but it's actually an investment in your workplace. And I think really that's what the business that our report was about, we think about education as human capital, but human capital is a much broader concept than that. And if you want a productive economy, you have to invest in people. And right now, the productive capacity of your people is at significant risk because of this recession. Now is the time to invest. It's not the time to step back. And I think it's great that funding has been kept at level, but the needs are much higher, and the community is going to need more support if you want them to be as productive as they have been in the past going forward. Otherwise, the New South Wales economy will not come back, and it will not come back as strong as it could.
Thank you, Angela. Look, we do know that people can really struggle to access mental health and also drug and alcohol services across the state, and particularly so in regional areas. So related to that, I have a question from the Mental Health Coordinating Council for Minister Ward, and it relates to the Special Commission into the drug ice, which recently handed its recommendations to the New South Wales Government, and the question is, how and when will Government address the issues raised in that report? Outside your portfolio, Minister, but...
Well, it is, but I take a special interest in this area, Joanna. As you know, or for those of you who don't know, I'm the member for Kiama as a local MP, and we've had a number of very, very tragic losses of life, particularly young people, and it's been absolutely heartbreaking. But I have seen firsthand some of the great work, the preventative work that has stopped the loss of life, I believe, and I think it's a real credit to the front line of the mental health staff and the clinicians that work so hard across subacute and acute programs, early intervention services, and I've seen also great community responses, and I think we're seeing that because of the pressures on young people being there like never before, particularly in regional areas. My area, as you know, Joanna, has been hit by drought, flood, fire and COVID-19, so it's been a really tough time for us. But look, I've been keeping across this issue because obviously it does affect why people come into services offered by my department, non-government partners, and I can advise that that is something the government will be responding to imminently. I've been in discussions with Minister Taylor and Minister Hazard about this, and I'm looking forward to them as the responsible ministers making the announcement shortly. But suffice to say, do have record investments. To Angela's point, state governments, I think Liberal, Labor, whatever, have actually acknowledged the importance of this issue. I also think though there's a long way to go with societal attitudes though. I think some people still stigmatise mental illness. I think we actually need to be brave enough to talk about it, and I think it's a real credit to leaders in communities, political leaders that have actually had the guts to admit to having their own demons they've had to confront, and I think that's helped a lot of people actually stand up and speak up about mental health and normalising the fact that you need treatments and you need support, and the right support's in the right places.
Thank you, Minister. And while I have got you there, I do have a question from the Physical Disability Council of New South Wales, who are very pleased that their funding is continuing. But the question is, how will the New South Wales Government ensure that the much higher rates of employment of people with disability in the public sector, given percentages have dropped over the past few years?
Well, I'd like to thank my friends at the Physical Disability Council and congratulate them for their wonderful advocacy, and I think there was a few of them who were starting to doubt whether or not I'd come good on that one, but I think we're very pleased to see that $112 million for disability advocacy inclusion in this budget. Look, the Premier has 14 priorities Government is about priorities. The things you fund, the things you support, the things you articulate are the things that are obviously front of mind. And one of the Premier's 14 priorities is increasing disability employment in the public sector to 5.6%. My own appointment as the First Minister for Disabilities to have lived experience of disability is an example of the Premier's commitment. But we want to see that right across government, and yes, there is a long way to go, but I'm meeting with Tim Reardon, the Secretary of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, early next year to get an update on that. I've already met with the Public Service Commissioner. I know the Premier is committed to this, passionately committed to this, as am I, and I want to see it happen. But you know what? It also needs to be the non-government sector and the corporate sector. But if government doesn't show leadership, if we don't say, here is what we're doing to place a focus on disability and employment, then you won't see people follow as well too. So we need to set a good example. But it's also, can I say, not just simply about identifying people that are already in your organisations. Nothing frustrates me more when I hear bureaucrats at government committees inquiries say, oh, we need to identify people that are already there. Wrong. You actually need to identify them when they're coming into the market and people are looking for jobs at the recruitment stage. And certainly that's going to be my message to government, the non-government sector and the corporate sector. If you want people to use your services, particularly people with disabilities, well, you better be an inclusive workplace as well too. And don't think for 1 second that I'm not going to be a fierce advocate for that issue, because not only do I want to see it, I believe it's the right thing.
Thank you. And look, I think we're going to have to leave it there as we've reached the end of our time. I do want to thank all our panellists, the Treasurer for joining us early on, Minister Ward for stepping into his shoes when he had to leave, the Shadow Treasurer, given the late nights that he's been working, we really appreciate you participating today, and Angela Jackson for always bringing a fresh perspective and making economics accessible to us all. Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who's participated. I know there were many questions that we didn't get to, but today really is the start of the discussion, and we will be working with government in the lead up to the May budget. I would now like to hand over to the President of NCOSS, David Fisher, for some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna, and apologies that I have a problem with our video link today and I'm not able to join you fully. But hello everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm David Fisher. I'm NCOSS President, and I'm also Chief Executive at Housing Plus here in the Central West. And I would just like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining this virtual meeting on Wiradjuri land and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. It's my pleasure to provide some concluding remarks to wrap up today's post-budget event. Notwithstanding that it's been virtual, I think it's been a thoroughly engaging event that's generated a lot of great discussion, great questions, and really highlighted the very real challenges that we're facing, but also some of the opportunities that lie ahead for us. Having the New South Wales Treasurer here, sharing his perspective on the state's fiscal and economic outlook, and listening and engaging on the issues that impact vulnerable and disadvantaged people across New South Wales and are of a real concern to us in the sector has been invaluable. Similarly, the perspectives of the Shadow Treasurer, the input that we've just received from the Minister for Families, Communities and Disability Services, and the great contribution from Angela Jackson from Equity Economics has enabled, I believe, a really well-rounded and robust discussion, very well facilitated by our very own Joanna. We thank them for their time today, for the thoughtful input and engagement. Today really highlights that while all of us in this virtual room may have many different views on the various issues that we face, I think we can all say that we're united in our quest for a strong recovery for New South Wales that doesn't leave anybody behind. The work of NCOSS, including today, would not be possible without the input from the sector, our supporters across government and business, and the interested individuals who share our values and goals. Thank you for coming along and for continuing to support our work. Now, a quick plug. If you're not a member of NCOSS, please join. And please register for tomorrow's AGM. It starts at 10 o'clock. It's open to members and non-members alike. We'll get the formal AGM business out and done fairly quickly. and then it will be over to Julian Morrow from Chaser, who will be the MC and provide an entertaining outlook on 2020. Panel, well-known faces from across the sector, and an audience quiz complete with prizes. So you can be part of the action online, or you can be in person at the venue. Go to the NCOSS website to get all the details, and we look forward to seeing you there. And finally, can I ask you to complete the post-event survey that will help the NCOSS team improve this event for next year? Again, ready?
Thank you.